Hello and welcome to the Best Life Podcast, where we here at Ultra Federal Credit Union are helping you live your best life. I'm your host, Tony Beyer. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I know that on the Best Life Podcast previously, we have spoken a little bit about cybersecurity, how to protect yourself online. And because it's always changing, the landscape and everything and all the different threats and everything that are always happening, we are here joined by Ironcore CEO Andy Minneker. He is here to tell us a little bit more about the threats that are happening to financial institutions and how they can protect themselves. So we really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy, Andy, but thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Best Life Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So one of the things that you said, and you really look in the news and everything like that, you mentioned Salt Typhoon. I was hoping that you could tell me a little bit more about that, because I thought it was just throwing salt over your shoulder very aggressively in a restaurant to ward off bad luck or something. And that turns out it has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So, Andy, what exactly are we talking about with Salt Typhoon?
Well, Salt Typhoon is an advanced persistent threat actor, and we'll just kind of make that a little bit smaller by calling it an APT group. And they are based out of China and likely fielded by the Chinese Communist Party. And the reason that I wanted to talk about those guys today is they've been in the news a lot and we've heard a lot about them, but it really hits home because they've breached 9 telcos in the United States. We found out about this in late 2023, and there's just been more and more data coming out. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the advanced persistent threats and some of the other actors, but Salt Typhoon is the big one that's been front of mind lately.
Okay. Tell us a little bit, how do they gain access? How does it happen? How is this discovered? So I'm going to be honest, I don't know a whole lot about this, but I'm so glad that you're here to educate us and let us know, Andy.
Sure. So Salt Typhoon has basically focused on counterintelligence. And so they decided that a good idea would be to attack critical infrastructure, and they started with the best place to get counterintelligence, which is generally communications networks. And so they've attacked and have successfully breached 9 large US telcos, Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, Lumen, Charter, Windstream, Consolidated Communications. There's 2 other ones that still haven't been listed yet, but they've been confirmed that there's 2 additional ones. So they're all up in our internet and telco business right now.
So what are they, with this information and with these breaches, what are they hoping to do, or what are they hoping to accomplish?
So they've already probably accomplished a lot of what they set out to accomplish. Now, there's a system called the Kalia system, and it's basically a system that was brought online back in I can't remember if it was the late 90s or early 2000s, but basically it was brought online because wiretapping was starting to not be useful for law enforcement because of the internet. And so they needed to get this capability built into the internet and voice over IP network. And so they have these Kalia systems. And what Salt Typhoon did was they broke into all these telcos, but on top of breaking into the telcos, they also broke into the wiretapping system. And so what they did was, evidently, they've exfiltrated the call log data for something like 1 million people out of the Washington, D.C. area. It's even, I guess, suspected that they used the Kalia wiretapping system to get information on the Trump campaign, on the Harris campaign, during the campaign. So this is a great way to softly collect all of this, what we call metadata. So the metadata stuff is call logs, text, like who you text, who texted you, not necessarily what was text, although in this case, normal SMS text messages are not protected by encryption. So if they wanted to look at them, it would be very easy for them to look at them. But what they did was they gathered all of the call logs for, we don't even know how many people. And so they've got all that metadata, but then they've actually got wiretap information on some, hundreds or thousands of people around the Washington, D.C. area. And that's a perfect place to be gathering that kind of counterintelligence.
Sure. I mean, you've got so many people there in politics, government's happening there, and a lot of information, which it's concerning, to say the least. So you mentioned SMS messages, and I know that we've talked about that in a previous, that those really aren't, those are just out there, right? And people can just, if they know a little bit about what they're doing, they could intercept that information. Is that correct?
Well, I can assume the Chinese knew what they were doing. The Salt Typhoon folks knew what they were doing. So I'm sure they gobbled up plenty of SMS messages. The interesting thing is there's other technology that's coming now or already landed that helps us with that kind of stuff. And this is what we can do as end users and consumers. We can switch over to things like Signal, which uses end-to-end encryption. Or some of you folks are probably familiar with WhatsApp, especially if you've got people that you're communicating with in foreign countries. WhatsApp's kind of a big deal. That's also end-to-end encrypted. And then there's a new kind of technology called RCS. And RCS has the ability of being encrypted, but is not necessarily forced to be encrypted. Now, for instance, anybody who's got an iPhone probably recognizes now their little green message says RCS when they're texting people without iPhones. Now, that's great, except for Apple's RCS implementation doesn't do end-to-end encryption. So any kind of communications you're doing cross-platform like that, unless you're using a specific application that can accomplish that, you don't get the end-to-end encryption.
Gotcha. Understandable. I know that I have an Android and I make the bubbles green or blue or whatever they're not supposed to be whenever I'm talking to somebody. I'm familiar a little bit with that. And I know that you're here talking with financial institutions, helping them out. What are some other ways in which you are helping out financial institutions, or what do they need to keep in mind to mitigate some of these risks and to try to keep their information safe and protected?
One of the scariest things about this breach was the initial access. The initial access used endpoint security devices as the initial access. So vulnerabilities that were in Fortinets, in other kind of VPN and network security devices, they use those vulnerabilities to gain initial access. And so all of us are running security devices, especially in our financial institutions. So one of the things that we can do is lower the amount of attack surface that we have from the outside in. So if people are probing us, they don't see things that are attackable. That would be the big one. So I would look at getting rid of traditional VPNs, things like that, and going to what we call Zero Trust Network Access, or ZTNA. And what that does is basically looks invisible to the internet unless somebody has a particularly crafted, cryptographically sound, already authenticated packet. And once that packet's received, then the connection opens up and then the person can connect to it. But if a threat actor is scanning that network, they don't see anything.
Okay. And then are there other ways or other services that you offer financial institutions that is able to help them stay safe and secure?
Absolutely. So we have a ZTNA platform that all of our customers get as part of our service. But we also have application allow listing and ring fencing. And application allow listing basically says that we won't let anything run on a PC unless you've already approved it. So that means anything. That means any malware that comes off the internet. That means any browser extension that Betty Sue downloads to shop at Amazon. We don't allow anything to run unless you tell us it's okay. So that lowers the attack surface because that includes malware. Somebody downloads something that's nefarious, it's not going to run. And then the ring fencing part of this. So one of the things that the Salt Typhoon folks did, it was once they had initial access, they started using what we call living off the land. And basically what that means is they're using tools that are installed automatically on every computer, things like PowerShell and command line utilities and things like that. So they're using those things to then spread the attack or stay persistent. And what ring fencing does is it says, hey, if I launch a Word document and this Word document's malicious and I've set rules for this application, now this application can't talk to the internet. Can't talk to PowerShell, can't talk to my registry, it can only open files. So all of a sudden I've lowered that attack surface considerably, even if somebody comes in with a 0-day or some sort of other vulnerability to attack that application. So that's one of the other things that we do to sort of lessen the boom.
Okay. We're speaking right now with CEO of Ironcore, Andy Minneker, talking, about some of the threats and hacks and breaches and things like that, and helping us stay more secure, from those different threat actors as well. So when it comes to, let's say, something like passwords, We've got, here at the credit union, a whole bunch of them. I'm sure, you do too and everything like that. What are some things that people should keep in mind when logging in with a password or things like that to keep things secure?
One of the easiest and most effective recommendations I can give is when you can enable multi-factor authentication. So that text to your phone, the one-time password, those kinds of things, when you can enable those, enable them. Because that way, if somebody sends you a phishing email and you accidentally key in some username and password information, that information along with the MFA is only good for about 30 seconds. So they're not harvesting that data and using it later that way. So that's one of the things. The other thing was use a password manager.
Okay.
And so the reason I say that is we want to use a different, very long and convoluted password that's unique for every service that we do. Now, that's just not doable if you've got to memorize and type that in. But if you've got a password manager, all you have to do is remember the password to your password manager. And then the password manager will actually pre-fill that information in for you as you're surfing to different websites. So my suggestion would be password manager and MFA. That's going to do the most to protect you.
Okay. And not just putting passwords on a Post-it note or something around your computer.
I tell you what, it depends on the threat model. So the Post-it notes around your computer are pretty awesome for 99.9% of the threat models because most of that is on the internet or some foreign entity or somebody somewhere else. Now, if it's your kid or your uncle that you're worried about, yes, you don't want to keep them on your monitor. But honestly, it's safer on paper than it is anywhere else from the general internet.
Interesting. Yeah. I always grew up like, don't put the password there and a Post-it under your keyboard or, have this whole notebook, full of passwords, right there, is what I was always, told growing up. And now we're saying like, yeah, if that's offline, that might work for you.
Well,
maybe.
The reason I make that recommendation is because, for instance, my father, I tried to get him to use a password manager and it just didn't work out.
Sure.
And so, based on his real vulnerability for him is external threat actors. And so I'm like, Dad, you know what? Go ahead and write it in the book. You go out, you keep your notebook that you just keep next to your nightstand, and that's where you keep everything. Odds are it's safe there from just about everybody.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of, I prefer a password manager because then it's safe from everybody, but any port in a storm. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know that Ironcore, it is a partner of ours through Vizio, that is our credit union service organization. And you work with financial institutions. Tell us about some of the other, services or how you're able to help those financial institutions stay safe and secure and protect themselves from threats and breaches.
Sure.
Like what we're talking about with the Salt Typhoon.
Yeah, we have a pretty complete cybersecurity platform. And most of our cybersecurity tooling comes with our base package because we really believe at Ironcore that we want to future-proof cybersecurity for you. We want to give you everything that you could possibly need, not only for cybersecurity, but also to help satisfy your compliance needs, also help satisfy your cyber insurance needs. So the more we do, the easier those things get. And the tooling that we provide, like the ZTNA infrastructure, like the allow listing, we're really future-proofing our customers from what's coming. So we have this infrastructure there and we can start building on this infrastructure. And so that's what we do. One of the other things that I did want to cover is something that I think often goes overlooked by IT departments is that when you have private circuits, you assume that those circuits are private because you're buying them from a telco. And sometimes they're called MPLS circuits. You assume those are private, but really that's on a shared infrastructure at the telco. And what we found out with Salt Typhoon is a lot of that infrastructure that's used to move those things, those packets from here to here, was infected. Okay. So what does that mean? That means when you're buying a private line, don't assume that the data that travels over there is private. First of all, it's not private from the telco. They can see it. What we should be doing, and most of us probably are doing this, but many aren't, is we should be encrypting those connections end to end, regardless of whether we consider them quote unquote private. And so what we do is we have an SD-WAN platform that takes a bunch of different connections, but encrypts all communications and then basically bundles the connections together and treats them all as one giant connection, for redundancy and fault tolerance and things like that. But we also encrypt everything, no matter where. If it hits that wire, it's encrypted. And that's really what I think is important to take away from this, is that the telcos, we don't know what was breached or what wasn't. But if we had it encrypted, we know it wasn't our stuff.
And when you're talking about encryption, I mean, that means something cannot be accessed, can't be opened unless someone's authorized or whatnot. You know, you were talking about, with the messages and everything like that being encrypted. That means nobody in the middle or anything like that would be able to intercept or do anything, correct?
So the way end-to-end encryption works is basically there's a protocol that allows you to start a conversation. And it starts the conversation by saying, hey, I want to start a conversation with you. Here's my public key. And this public key is a way for you to encrypt things that only I can decrypt. So then the other side of that conversation happens almost the exact same way. Now we both have each other's encryption keys. Now we're talking. The exchange of those encryption keys is generally called asynchronous cryptography. And then what we're doing is exchanging a long charactered encryption key. And then we use what's called synchronous cryptography to actually do the communications. And from a VPN perspective, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, before it ever gets onto the provider's network, we're going to encrypt it. And then when it leaves the provider's network and comes back to our network, then we'll decrypt it. But anytime it's on the provider's network, nobody can see it.
Okay.
It looks like junk, basically.
Okay. Good to know with all that. Those are all the questions I have for you. I know that you're incredibly busy as the CEO of Ironcore. And again, we're speaking with Andy Minneker of Ironcore, based here in Onalaska, correct? Awesome. Yes. That's all the questions that I have for you. Are there any questions that, here at the end that I haven't asked, or anything that you wanted to talk about here at the end, Andy?
I would just say anybody who's on the IT team at any financial institution that might be listening to this, it's a good time to just kind of take a lay of the land and make sure that you don't have anything sitting on the outside of your network that might be attackable. And then also, it's probably a good time to talk about how we can authenticate our users or our customers. The reason I mention this is because, as community financial institutions, one of the best parts about that is your people. You know your members, your customers, you know them. And so when you hear them on the phone, you know who they are. Well, deep fakes, stuff like that, not good. So I guess it's a little off topic, but that is one that I think every community financial institution needs to figure out, because it's really coming. And there's already been a $25 million loss in Hong Kong with deepfake technology, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Sure, yeah. With AI, I mean, that's another conversation, and how that is how that is happening as well. How can people reach you? Where can they find you to get more information? You
can find us at ironcore-inc.com, or you can email me at andy@ironcore-inc.com.
Excellent. And we'll have that information in the show notes as well. But really appreciate you taking the time to be on the Best Life podcast, Andy.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
On this episode of the Best Life podcast, we spoke with Andy Minneker, who is the CEO of Ironcore Incorporated. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Best Life podcast, brought to you by Ultra Federal Credit Union. We appreciate you taking a moment to learn how you could live your best life. If you have a question or a topic you'd like us to cover, send me an email at tjbuyer@ultra.org. And who knows, it may even make it into a future episode. Don't forget to follow the Best Life podcast pretty much wherever you get your podcasts, or find it on our website at ultra.org. Thanks again, be well, and we'll talk to you again soon.